Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. The heavens aren't taken by consensus, but by force. So said Pablo Iglesias, leader of the Podemos. Hello, Spanish people! This is all going on in bankster-occupied Spain. Meanwhile, in bankster-occupied Britain... Stacey?
Yes, we're going to compare a few locations around the world that are having some sort of uprising or protest against sort of new policies being brought in by the governments around the world in response to the financial crisis. So here in the UK, we saw this week some big protests regarding the education. You know, the cost of education is the second highest in the world here in the UK, only after the United States. And so people were protesting, and here is a tweet. David Cameron, F you, we deserve a future too. Hashtag free education, hashtag November 19, hashtag no future, hashtag utopia now. Of course, a lot of people voted in, a lot of students elected or chose in the democratic process the Lib Dem party, who promised that they wouldn't triple tuition fees. At the beginning of the coalition government, remember, it used to cost £3,000 per year for education. Now it's £9,000. Consequently, students are now graduating with debts of the equivalent of £44,200 versus £24,000 at the beginning of this coalition government.
Yeah, it's like pouring cement onto this generation to keep them locked. And of course, to get the jobs to pay off the student debt, they end up working for people like GSHQ, the spy network that works at NSA to look in people's bank accounts and steal all their money. So the opportunities are like in the defense contracting business. Oh, I got to become a drone operator to pay off my student debt so I can fly a drone over to Pakistan and kill some wedding folks at their party because I think that they are responsible in some way for some guy in Shoreditch or Woolwich or Shire getting their head cut off. No, that's not it. No, no, no.
I see actually Lockheed Martin, by the way, is pitching for a £1 billion NHS contract. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that the privatization of the education system, I mean, the money, that £9,000 goes via the banking system into house price speculation in London for oligarchs from around the world.
So here they are pleading with David Cameron, please let us have a future. We beg you, please. But at the same time, earlier this week, at the same time that these people were protesting, Tories were in Rochester campaigning against Mark Reckless, the former Conservative who changed over to the UKIP party, and therefore they had a by-election. Well, the headline reads, "A reckless vote will make your home worth less," Tories tell Rochester voters. So here they were promising voters house price increases, which is the exact opposite of helping this generation of students. Now, obviously, this didn't work because the guy was elected.
Well, I mean, that's what this government's all about, is offering voters a chance to increase their house prices based on this policy of ultra-low interest rates, which has the corollary of financing fraud and all kinds of corporate misdoings. So people in the UK, they get, in London, for example, the house price goes up by about £450 per day. So they can extract that money and go buy crack and buy booze, because, you know, they like to... they get the vote for the Cameron and the coalition to get their house price up by £450, and they go to the bank, HSBC, and they take out, you know, and they go down to the off license and buy some crack and booze and like, I'm British, wee, then they vomit, and I see it every single day all over Soho, piles of vomit. I mean, in France, you've got dog poop, but in Britain, it's human vomit. That's what defines the British people here.
Well, we've covered often this notion of the share buybacks liquidating companies, and this is also the housing stock buyback, using borrowed money, just like Wall Street is doing, and essentially liquidating the economy, because it's becoming a rentier economy, which has no real economy with which to produce wealth.
Well, that's an excellent point. Let me reiterate that point. It's so frickin' good that in America, stock prices are goosed by buying back their own stock. They're not
with borrowed money.
With the borrowed money, but they're not investing in capital goods. They're not in
CapEx.
CapEx down. They're not. It's not going into wages.
Yeah.
It's just going into buying back their own stock. So here in the UK, the equivalent is buying back housing which is causing the same kind of bubble mentality and crowding out the vast majority of people. And the government completely supports this.
And in fact, we learned this week that only 11% of all outstanding loans from the banking system here, only 11% is for all of the businesses that are non-property related and manufacturing. So only 11%. The rest is all to property related loans, which is obviously why, you know, and all the policies of the government are to stoke more of these loans for more property, but it's share buyback, it's housing stock buyback, which is shrinking the real economy and shrinking the opportunities for the young who are having to pay for education, but also for the jobs, because this week it emerged that for again, median wages only went up by £1 per week.
Right, well, just like
the lowest since the 90s.
The average graduate has to take a job with the military to pay off their student loan because they're the only ones paying, so you can't get a job as a professor or a nurse or a fireman. They don't pay enough to pay off your loans. The country itself of Britain, to pay off the debt, remember, under Osborne, the debt has increased by almost £1 trillion under Osborne.
Yes, to normal people like us, but to accountants it's shrunk because they could make 1.4 trillion look smaller than the 500 billion it started out with. Remember, accounting tricks can make it seem like it's disappeared.
Right, but I'm saying that, you know, in this country of Britain, because the whole country is as indebted as students graduating from university, they end up on that other end of the telephone when America calls and say, bomb these Pakistani people, bomb these Afghani people, go kill these people.
Survey your people.
Go survey your people. So they've lost their sovereignty because they're in such incredible debt. Because to pay off the debt, they have to do what every frickin' psycho Pentagon idiot wants them to do. They have no. I mean,
and then they end up being laughed at because here in another story of a bailed out nation, which is Ireland, which bailed out. It needed a bailout, by the way, for no reason. The government decided to bail out unsecured bondholders of Anglo-Irish Bank for some reason. We don't know. And you can look it up yourself. But what happened is here, a poll, Germans say Irish took austerity lying down. What do you think? The Germans in a poll are mocking the Irish for having no backbone. The study carried out by Red Sea found that 60% of Germans think that the Irish public did not show enough opposition when the country was bailed out.
Right, and in Ireland's case, it's not like tuition fees went up, and so that generation, 10 to thousands of young Irish people didn't have to endure a higher tuition fee. They simply got on a plane and flew to frickin' New Zealand, to Australia, to Canada, to America. They lost tens of thousands of this generation. So the economy, comparatively, is doing quote-unquote better unless you include the fact that an enormous percentage of your population, the young, vibrant entrepreneurs of tomorrow, have left. And now you've just got corporate occupiers who take advantage of the tax breaks and a bunch of frickin' old ladies sitting around drinking tea, living on pension accounts that are being chopped in half because interest rates are so low.
Not the old ladies. They're not being chopped in half.
No,
Not yet.
Not yet. But as soon as they run out of fuel this winter because of high costs of gas and oil, I'm sure they'll start chopping up old ladies and burning them down there at the pub with a pint of Guinness. Okay. Oh, there's old Granny. Set her on fire! Yeah.
Obviously, they're now starting to protest about the water charges because, of course, there's, obviously a shortage of water in Ireland, I've never been there, actually, when it's not raining. But finally, we're going to move over to Spain, another bankster-occupied country, where we see the rise of Podemos and its People's Assembly. Podemos is a new party started only a year or two ago, and it's already got 5 members of the European Parliament that they elected, and they've just held a People's Assembly, which was crowd-funded. And at this People's Assembly, Pablo Iglesias, he asked the crowd not to cheer during one of his speeches and declare that the heavens aren't taken by consensus, but by force, a new iconic moment in Spanish political history. So here, through the crowd is taking, not through violent force, but through force. They're not asking permission from the two parties. All of our democracies, whether in the US it's Republican or Democrat, you have to get with the permission of one of these party apparatus to run for elected office. Here they're saying, we are the people, we're going to kick out, he wants to catalog all the debt of Spain, of the bailout, and see which is legitimate, which is illegitimate, and wipe away the illegitimate debt. Things like this.
Seize the day! Well, Spain is rocking the world of politics using crowdfunding. So what I just did on StartJoin is I just listed a new concept to get a legal opinion here in the UK, how crowdfunding fits in with UK campaign finance law. You know, because we're going to use crowdfunding to rock politics in the UK. We've got some candidates lined up, and more on that, you know, in future episodes.
Yeah, well, for example, I know Russell Brand says he doesn't want to run for mayor, but we could force him upon the heavens here. If the crowds just, you know, use a crowdfunding platform and install the leader they want, whether they want.
Well, that's a good example.
For
example, if the crowd, and we got this thing funded, this legal opinion, crowdfunding in UK finance law, and then the crowd said, yeah, we want Russell Brand, let's say maybe as mayor of London, we could make it happen because the sky is ours to take. We're not waiting for permission. We don't need David Cameron to give us our blessing. He's not the frickin' Pope. I thought Henry VIII severed the whole relationship with the Pope. I mean, isn't Britain supposed to be, you know, about not religious theocratical fanatics who behead people for HSBC like David Cameron does every day? I mean, isn't that what it's supposed to be about? What about the people? So if we want Russell as mayor of London, we can use a crowdfunding like Spain. Spain is now leading the revolution.
The crowdfunding. So what Podemos did is they crowdfunded their People's Assembly. And the People's Assembly was held at the Palacio Vistalegre, the once spiritual home of the Spanish Socialist Party, but abandoned since 2011. It was no coincidence that Podemos decided to stage their first People's Assembly at this location. In their eyes, the Socialist Party long ago abandoned its roots as the defender of the Spanish working class, choosing instead to join the corrupt political elite. So that's the reason why we need to force new political structures, because the old ones, the old apparatus party political machines are occupied.
Right. The mainstream politics in the UK is dead. So you have Nigel Farage is rising up. It's not, you know, Nigel Farage is like an average politician, but against the backdrop of a political establishment that is so completely dead, he's got huge traction because he actually has a pulse. Yeah. Unlike the Tories, the Lib Dems, or Labour that are technically dead.
Yes,
there's
but he does want an NHS privatized, and now we know that Lockheed Martin wants to run some of the NHS.
Okay, well, if someone's going to go up against Nigel, they've got to go crowdfunding and do something against Nigel. Forget the mainstream party politics. They are all freaking dead. All right, Stacey, we've got to go. Thanks.
Podemos.
Podemos. Hi, Spain. Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to author and professor John Mill Ackerman. He's usually a professor in Mexico, but this academic year he's in Paris. Welcome to the show.
Max, wonderful to be on your show.
All right, so John Mill Ackerman, tell us about the turmoil in Mexico. What's going on at the moment?
Well, Mexico is in the middle of an uprising. This is an uprising which is, I think, comparable to, although not the same thing, to the other citizen uprisings that have been happening, you know, over the last 5 years all around the world. The Mexican uprising is a little different, though, because in Latin America, we've had a general response among the citizenry and in politics throughout Latin America over the last, 10, 20 years to economic reform and economic transition over the last 20 years. And Mexico had been kind of left out of the game. In Mexico, we haven't had a real response from society to these privatizing neoliberal reforms of the last 20 years. And we're finally seeing it. The important thing to point out here is that this is not despite Peña Nieto's reforms of the last 2 years. It's actually because of Peña Nieto's reforms of the last 2 years. This is a citizen uprising against Peña Nieto's policies. It's about impunity, it's about injustice, it's about drug trafficking, but it's also about economics.
Yeah, well, we've been calling it on this show the global insurrection against banker occupation. It's been going on for about 3, 4, 5 years now. It's popping up all over the world. Tunisia, Athens, Hong Kong, in America as well, and now it's in Mexico. So you say it's because of the reforms that have come along, not in spite of the reforms. So so that would sound as if the Mexican government, basically like the United Kingdom government, is just being subsumed by a corporate fascist agenda, and now the people have woken up. Is that correct?
Well, that would be a pretty good way of summarizing it. The Enrique Peña Nieto came into power on December 1st, 2012, and for the last 2 years has basically oriented the entire country towards complying with orders on one hand on the political side from Washington and internationally from the international financial interests, and particularly the oil companies. Mexico just reformed a few months ago Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution. This article goes back to the Mexican Revolution, which, by the way, November 20th, the day of global protests for Mexico, is the anniversary, 104th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution. And this Article 27 is what allowed, in 1938, Lázaro Cárdenas, which was the great state builder of historical Mexico, to nationalize the oil companies and to send out the international corporations and the foreign governments. And this was actually the centerpiece for the Mexican welfare state. Thanks to that oil expropriation in 1938, Mexico was able to build grand universities like the National University, healthcare, public healthcare systems, education also at the elementary school level, infrastructure projects. And what Peña Nieto has done over the last year is basically cut out that nationalization. He's in the process of privatizing the oil, and oil amounts to 1/3 of the national budget in Mexico. So this means cutting out, we already had problems with social welfare, but now we're going to have to cut it out even more. So this is really a popular insurrection, not only about the justice for the kids, which is very important. Injustice, crime, narco-trafficking has taken over Mexico, but it's also about neoliberal reform and a response to that. And like I said, Mexico had been out of the game. There's been this sort of pink tide throughout Latin America, everything from Brazil to Venezuela to Chile to Central America, El Salvador, Bolivia. But Mexico had sort of experienced no change, and now the people are demanding to be part of this change in Latin America and in the world.
Yeah, well, you talk about the narcotics problem in Mexico, the cocaine in Mexico, and this global insurrection against banking occupation. But to bring it back to the banks, we know that HSBC, a UK bank, was paid a fine for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. They, by some accounts, would have a direct responsibility for the tens of thousands of beheadings. What do you make of the hypocrisy of, let's say, the UK government, where HSBC is domiciled, being outraged by beheadings that occur, let's say, in the United Kingdom? They had one up in some nearby town recently, within the past few months. They're outraged by the beheadings.
Yes.
But then HSBC finances the beheadings for tens of thousands of people in Mexico, and David Cameron just sits there with his thumb up his swing and doesn't say anything about it. What do you make of the hypocrisy of all this?
Well, this is a very good point. It's not only HSBC, of course. There is a recent case exactly in which HSBC was found to be laundering drug money in Mexico, as well as other sorts of crooked deals throughout the world. And they were fined, but they haven't been criminally prosecuted. They're too big to fail, no? So both the U.S. and the British governments haven't gotten to the bottom of this. And of course, by laundering money and by helping the drug cartels in this way, they are directly responsible for this violence in Mexico. There was a report, I think this was in the Guardian or the Independent a few years ago, which demonstrated how Wachovia Bank in 2007, 2008 basically bailed out the United States economy based on drug money. It was by pulling up drug money from Mexico in 2007, 2008 that the United States banking system was allowed to keep afloat.
Yeah, let me jump in there for a second there. Let me jump in there for a second, because a lot of people are unaware of this story, and I'm glad you've brought this forward and now can confirm this story, is that Wachovia Bank, HSBC, because of the investigation into the cambios, which are used to launder this drug money, shutting down the profits for Mexican drug cartels. They shut down this operation, which is by some accounts, the single greatest contributory to the global financial crisis of 2008, because the actual cash was cut from entering the economy. This set off a chain reaction of the global financial crisis. It all comes back to this drug money. It had nothing to do with macro-prudential policy. It had nothing to do with failed policies. It was tied directly to people putting the chocha up their nose then in Washington, in Westminster, all over the world, and HSBC financing it. Isn't that correct?
Yes, there's a very direct connection here, and of course the other side of the coin are the weapons, of course, right? So this is also an economic interest. The United States weapons industry is earning a lot of money out of this drug war in Mexico. The thousands of guns, high-powered weapons, which are exported across the border from the United States to Mexico, is also a very important source of funding for important business interests in the United States. And this is also directly affecting, of course, these beheadings and this violence in Mexico. Mexico is really an important country, not only because it's an enormous country of 120 million people. It's the about 14th largest GDP in the world, but it's also very strategically located right next to the United States, and it's been forced to suffer the consequences in terms of violence, poverty, instability, which the more developed countries like the UK or the United States don't want to deal with. So they're sort of outsourcing this violence towards Mexico, and now good news is that the Mexican people are rising up. I think it's really important to have international solidarity, because this has been the central point which has allowed social movements to rise up in Mexico, because they've been active for a long time, for many years, perhaps decades. The difference today is that they are getting lots of attention and solidarity internationally in Latin America, in the United States, and in Europe. And this is what allows them to have that strength and most importantly, to stop the temptations for repression from the Mexican government, because those temptations are, of course, very strong.
Well, let's take a look at a country like Colombia. Of course, they were rocked with similar violence and money laundering and global banking influence. They seem to have kind of turned it around. Even cities like Medellin are now relatively peaceful. Is that the path of Mexico? How did they do it? What did they do? How did Colombia become this way?
Well, there's a lot of fantasy about what's actually happened in Colombia, but you're right. There has been a reduction in some of the violence and the chaos. Now, there's an important difference between Colombia and Mexico. In Colombia, there is a strategic alliance between leftist guerrillas and the narco-traffickers. Right? In Mexico, it's the other way around. The strategic alliance is between the narco-traffickers and the government. So this changes the situation. And this is why things are different on the ground here in Mexico. Well, actually, when Peña Nieto came into power in 2012, he brought on as his top anti-narcotics drug war advisor, Oscar Naranjo, who's the chief of police in Colombia under Uribe. And one of the things that Uribe has done in Mexico, as he did in Colombia, was develop these paramilitary organizations which could combat in Colombia simultaneously the guerrillas and the drug leaders. But here it's been a little bit more complicated, because these paramilitary organizations are working directly against society itself, and in complicity, as they were in Colombia, of course, but in complicity with the Mexican government. And so things are much more complicated, although they might be a little bit more clear, because the citizen uprising in Mexico is not about ideology at all. It's about corruption, anti-corruption. It's about transparency, and there's a lot more of a broad societal support for this movement. Even in, the urban middle classes are coming out into the streets and supporting this demand for change.
Well, is there anyone within the protest movement in Mexico reaching out to their sister protest movements in places like the United Kingdom or Spain? Obviously has a huge uprising now, Spanish-speaking. Is there any kind of coalition, or a global coalition? Because they're facing a global problem. The central banks and the global banks like HSBC are the common problem. Do the protesters know that HSBC is their public enemy #1? That HSBC is essentially the worst actor in this? Do they understand that in Mexico? And of course, we're translated into Spanish on this show. And when we started being translated into Spanish, it seems like that's when the uprisings began. But anyway, putting that point aside for a second, do they understand HSBC's role in their misery?
I think many of them do, many of us do. I'm a Mexican citizen myself. I think it's very important that we are talking here on your show. And yes, exactly, there is an international movement arising. Just as, if you remember, 20 years ago in 1994, there was a Zapatista uprising in Chiapas in southern Mexico, which was in many ways the point of starting up of this international coalition against some of the free trade agreements, against the control of banking and finance. And once again, Mexico is becoming a center for the articulation, yes, of an international, a global movement. I think that people are very aware of the role of banking and international finance in this conflict, and there has been lots of international solidarity. In the United States itself, for instance, remember, there are about 50 million Mexicans in the United States, and they have woken up too, and have started to march and protest also in the streets. On next December 3rd, they're having a national movement of Latinos, and not only Latinos, but U.S. citizens in general, in solidarity with Mexico throughout the United States. They're saying, calling it 43 cities for 43 students.
All right, John, we're going to have to cut her off there. I hope to actually be doing the show Keiser Report in Mexico City over the holidays coming up. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much, Max. A pleasure and an honor.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, John Mill Ackerman. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.